Hello friends, welcome. Friends, I would like to draw your attention to this headline. India aiming for 10% 6G IPRs. Ashwini Vaishnavji. And then there is another article which was published in the same time frame, which says that India looks towards becoming a global leader with 6G. So friends, why I am doing this video today? The reason I am doing this video is that if you recall, India tried its level best to become a global leader in 5G also. There was a technology called 5GI. And that 5GI was an Indian technology, and Indian innovator tried to push it through ITU as well as 3GPP. And that experience, what India achieved through the whole process, whether they achieved anything meaningful, and why today we don't see those features in our phones, which India developed or claimed to have developed at the time when this whole process was going on, is what we are going to describe in this video. So this is going to become a learning experience as to what India did at the time when they were struggling to incorporate their innovation in 5G technology and what we can learn from that experience. So friends, this is going to be a very, very interesting video. Watch till the end. The things that you're going to learn from this video, you will not be able to get anywhere because this is a very technical subject and it has to be understood in a very simple manner, because what I am trying to do today is to convey a very technically complicated subject in a layman's language to my viewers who would like to understand that what kind of potential India has and what learnings that India needs to map onto in order to really get into the level of 6G leadership that India is aspiring for. So friends, look at this article. This article was published recently, 31st July 2025, where the Indian standard body, which is called TSDSI, and the African Telecom Unit has inked a plan of collaboration with 5G, 6G, AI, and rural broadband standard. And then, if you look at the time of September 11, 2020, Professor Bhaskar Ramurthy, he was the chairman of IIT Madras, was leveling allegation against global telecom gear makers, saying that they are opposing Indian local standard because it conflicts with their business. So the Indian radio interface technology was being branded by the global vendors as not being a folk standard. Means it was considered to be a very, very trivial thing. That is what the understanding from this article is. And then in year 2022, January, 5GI technology, which was the Indian folk, was finally blended with the 5G standard of the global standard. And then India never pursued their 5GI aspiration going forward. And what became part of the 5G standard and why we are not seeing those features in our handset is what we are going to discuss in this presentation. So the title of this presentation is 5GI, what India tried, what 5G accepted, means the global standard accepted, and why you don't notice any kind of impact on your handset of the Indian standard. Which, if any of the features which India tried to promote in 5GI got incorporated in the standard, definitely press would have spoken about it, government would have spoken about it, but when we don't see any of those discussion. So friends, in just one slide, what was the summary effort and why we failed is captured in this slide. So what India tried to do? India tried to increase the uplink capability of the device, right? To stretch the range without breaking the power limits. And this is very, very important, friends. Just notice this, focus on this sentence. So what does it mean? It basically means, we'll come back to this slide. So what basically it means is that a device, which is right here, is trying to communicate to the base station, right? So this is basically bidirectional. Device is talking to the base station and the base station is talking to the device. Now, the problem that we face today is that the phone has got a hard limit of 23 dBm. Why? Because if the phone transmits above this power level, then it is going to violate the SAR standard. SAR is a specification to prevent harm to human beings. So you limit the power to 23 dBm, and therefore the uplink is the bottleneck of mobile coverage. So when you say coverage, coverage is determined by the uplink between the phone and the BTS, means phone's capability to talk to the base station, not the other way. Because BTS is not driven by this 23 dBm. There are other power regulations, but those are more relaxed compared to the device, right? So this is what India tried to achieve. India tried to enhance the uplink range, right? So, so this they tried to do, and how they tried to do without breaking the safety power limit, which I spoke about, which was how much? 23 dBm. So they wanted to limit within the power levels of 23 dBm and still was trying to stretch the uplink capability. So the idea was added to global 5G standard as an optional tool. Means if any operator demanded those features, then they could have been incorporated in the device. Now, the problem was that these tools which India developed was not worth implementing under the Indian situation. Why? We are going to discuss this going forward in this presentation, because if you had implemented this in the 700 megahertz band or the 3.5 gigahertz band, which is the 5G band, you would have hurt the edge speeds more than it helped the coverage. Meaning the speeds would have got at the edge of the network, what got depressed so much that any coverage gain would not have given you any kind of value, right? So that was the net summary of this video, which we'll keep on discussing as we move forward. So the problem that we wanted to solve, we have already discussed the up 23 dBm, which is the power limit of the mobile because of safety and SAR limits. Now, friends, we need to note one thing, that at higher frequency, which is greater than 6 gigahertz, as you move in the high frequency, the ears of the device, that is the mobile phone and the base station, decreases. Means it shrinks in size because of this lambda square. Means there is a concept called receiver aperture, which is nothing but analogous to ear of the form factor device or the base station. So as you increase the frequency, because as you increase the frequency, the wavelength is inversely proportional to frequency, and the receiver aperture is square of the wavelength. Therefore, your size of the ear decreases exponentially. So higher the frequency, lesser will be this range that we speak about, right? Which we spoke about. So the result was the uplink becomes very, very weak. So uplink is the weak link, especially from far away tower, right? So friends, so this is the conventional OFDMA carrier, which is used everywhere, whether it is 4G, 5G, Wi-Fi. This is how the overall structure of the frame structure is. Now, you don't have to get overwhelmed by this OFDMA structure. I don't want to confuse you. You just look at the frequency. Now, this is the bandwidth. Now, this bandwidth can be 10 megahertz, 100 megahertz, 400 megahertz, depending upon how much quantum spectrum you have and how much has been assigned to the operator. Just focus on this and forget this part. Okay, this is just to give you a reference how the OFDMA subcarriers are structured, right? So normally what happens is that this wave, this particular frame passes through a filter in order to mitigate noise. And the characteristics of the filter is something like this. It's a flat response. So you have got, let's say, a 10 megahertz of bandwidth. So you have a filter of 10 megahertz, and there could be an adjacent channel of another operator which would have another 10 megahertz, 5 megahertz, depending on what bandwidth is. So the objective of this filter is to reduce spillover impact. Means the power that is here does not get out into the neighboring block of spectrum. So which is why this filter has a rectangular response, but normally rectangular response are hard to create. This is an ideal response. You will always have some kind of spillover, but that spillover has to be mitigated to an extent that the interference that it causes to the neighboring band is as low as possible. Now, what we are trying to do with a modified filter response, which is called the Indian version of 5GI, which uses a technology called pi by 2 BPSK. You don't have to worry about this term, is to boost the central components of the frequencies and depress the edges. Now, by doing that, what would happen? Because if you do a power calculation over this will come out to be 23 dBm, because this is a rectangular filter, right? And whatever signals passes through it will have power associated with that. So you do an integration over this whole rectangle and you get 23 dBm. Now, if you change the shape of the rectangle and make this something like this, then you'll find that the area of this, curve will be equal to this curve. And how it will be equal? Because what you have done, you have boosted the central component of the frequency and depressed the edges. And when you depress the edges, then what happens is that the average power is held constant at 23 dBm. But how the coverage is increased? The coverage is increased because the central components, which are also carrying, which is the resource, carrying frequency, or you can say subcarriers, which I showed you here, right? So these are the subcarriers. So there will be many such subcarriers, and some will lie in the center and some will lie in the edge. So the central subcarrier becomes more pronounced. They are amplified and they can travel very far. Whereas the subcarriers which are at the edge will become depressed and they will not be able to travel very far. So you change the shape of the wave in such a way that you stretch the bandwidth. We stretch the coverage by boosting the central components of the subcarrier. But the compromise here is that you are going to have a very low speed at the edge of the network, because the bandwidth will shrink, because the rest of the bandwidth where you depress the subcarriers won't travel that far, but your overall power will remain within the 23 dBm, because if you integrate this area, this will translate to this area. That is how you shape the signal, right? So the tool used to enable this is called pi by 2 BPSK, right? So what pi by 2 BPSK does? So this becomes very, very spiky, and this may destabilize the network, and it can cause oscillation. To prevent that, we use a technology called pi by 2 BPSK to smoothen this curve in such a way that there are no oscillation. So that is what pi by 2 BPSK does. It makes the signal less spiky. Power amplifier can run closer to its limit and cleanly without any kind of failures. So what it does, it actually creates a headroom and makes the center boost viable without raising power levels. As I told you, it will stretch the signal further by 1 to 2 dBm, right, without causing the average power to increase beyond 23 dBm. But in the process, will sacrifice data speeds at the edge, because this overall bandwidth which has been boosted up is of a lower value compared to the total bandwidth, right? So the trade-off you can't dodge, which we already spoke about. Boosting the middle means trimming the edges. Edge data rate will fall. With a narrow uplink bandwidth, for example, if you see in India, why it failed in India? Because we are trying it on 700 megahertz band with a bandwidth of only 10 megahertz. Now, if you have a bandwidth of 10 megahertz only, imagine that only 25% of the bandwidth is boosted, right? Which is how much? 25 means 2.5 megahertz, and if the 2.5 megahertz is what will reach the handset at the edge, or the handset is going to communicate only using the 2.5 megahertz band, imagine the kind of data throughput is going to fall at the edge of the network. And that is why, friends, it made no sense as far India's 700 megahertz band is concerned, and even in 3.5 it made no sense, because it was mainly designed for rural deployment, where you wanted to bring down the density of the base station or the tower density in order to save cost and OPEX as well as CAPEX. But in 3.5 gigahertz band, you generally don't deploy in the rural area, because the 700 megahertz grid is so thin that an overlay of 3.5 on 700 megahertz would create a lot of dark spot. So net is some extra reach but slow edge speed, often a bad deal in the sub 6 gigahertz band. So this sub 6 gigahertz spectrum is called FR1, and when you go above sub 6 gigahertz, when you go above 6 gigahertz, then it becomes FR2. Now the funny part was that for FR2, this innovation was already implemented in 3GPP, because the gains in FR2 were much more compared to FR1, because in FR2 you generally had bandwidth which is very large, sometimes 400 megahertz, sometimes 1 gigahertz. For example, millimeter wave, an operator has got 1 gigahertz of bandwidth. Now if you have a 1 gigahertz of bandwidth, let's say if you have 1 gigahertz and you have just boosted only 25% of that bandwidth, which is center frequencies, then how much you have boosted? You have boosted 250 megahertz. So 250 megahertz, if you are going to get at the edge of the network, is still going to be a very large speed. And the trade-off between speed and coverage is going to make it useful to implement this technology, because you will be able to stretch the the coverage by 1 to 2 dB, and your speeds at the edge of the network is not going to fall significantly because you have got plenty of spectrum. 1 gigahertz is a huge amount of spectrum, and therefore this curve, this particular beam shaping, shaping of signal is worth doing above 6 gigahertz band, right? So that is why 6 gigahertz, above 6 gigahertz band, it was already implemented in 3GPP. And what we were trying to do, we were trying to bring that innovation below 6 gigahertz band where there was no real utility. So where this trick actually shines, which I told you, very high path loss, tiny ears, and it was above 6 gigahertz band, which is FR2. Then wide channel, it had got wide channel TDD channels, giving a little edge energy, barely hertz capacity. That's why it was already implemented at that frequency levels. And every 1 to 2 dB of headroom is valuable, meaning the uplink significantly benefits because you still have roughly around 250 megahertz of spectrum to transmit your data because the bandwidth can be as high as 1 gigahertz. It can be more than that per operator, just be like we have in the 26 gigahertz band. Why didn't help India's 5G, which is FR1 reality, which is below 6 gigahertz band? Because we have got very, very low bandwidth in the low frequency bands, like 700 or 10 megahertz, 800 also 10 megahertz per operator, 900 megahertz also very, very less. Some operators have less than even 5 megahertz, at the range of 5. So, and the coverage is not a very big problem because I told you it is lambda square, right? So in low frequency band, you already have a good coverage. So further increasing the coverage or stretching the coverage, the cost of reducing the edge speed significantly made no sense. So 700 megahertz uplink is narrow. Trimming the edge kills speed. 3.5 gigahertz band anyway is not suitable for rural deployment, and that is why it failed miserably. So what 3GPP did with India's idea? So India was trying to position this as a separate, fork, means separate standard, means India standard. Later, it amalgamated or merged with 3GPP as an optional feature which any vendor can implement depending upon the demand from an operator. Now, Indian operators never demanded a increased stretch of coverage in the rural area because, as I told you, it made no sense. It would make the network completely hopeless because there was no demand, therefore no vendor implemented it, right? So, but the good news is that we did not fragment the standard, and it would have created a huge confusion in the global market. We went with the global tide and kept this as an optional standard for future implementation, though it has not been implemented, and you know the reason why. So this is the reason. Optional feature only appear if operator demanded, right? And the phones enable them, test them. India's current bands with the trade-off wasn't worth it. So for no operator pool means OEM didn't ship it, and user therefore don't see the change. So this is the chart which gives you the timeline, what happened, how India navigated through this whole process in ITU and 3GPP. You can pause the video and have a look at this, right? And we learned a lot during this process. What India did and what kind of achievement that we have been able to accomplish. So the first thing is that we never splitted the standard. It would have created a huge problem, especially on testing of those devices. The device prices would have increased significantly. So we integrated it. It was a good decision. What we have achieved is that we have now learned to align with global standard faster, because the process of aligning with global standard or creating or incorporating your technology into the global standard is a very complex political process. Unless you know the process, you will never be able to navigate your way through. So this whole process was a learning experience for India. Though we failed, we didn't achieve much, but it was a learning experience which we can leverage in 5G. The aspiration that India has, that 10% of our patents, global patents, India wants to have access to, right? India wants to own, right? So the clear takeaway is you can't raise the average power, so you can only rearrange it. That was the technology of PAPR to BPSK that helps above 6 gigahertz band but hurts the sub gigahertz band of India because of the reason which I've already explained. That's why you didn't feel any change on your phone, right? So what India should do differently? Say, look, this is what we need to learn. We can't just impose the technology for the sake of it, right? Because whatever was available above 6 gigahertz, if you're trying to implement the same thing below 6 gigahertz with no value, right, which the operator would see or the device manufacturer would see, why would they implement it? And that is where the disconnect was. You push your way through, that is fine, but you need to develop something valuable which somebody would be willing to accept and develop in the phone. So if you don't develop anything valuable, it will make no sense. Nobody will implement it. Even if you make that standard mandatory. And if you do so, you make a standard mandatory, because of the testing costs, because of the economies of scale, the device for India is going to become very pricey and it will make no sense. So India needs to learn from its mistake and try to develop technologies which are of value not only to India but to the rest of the world. Pause the video and have a look at this. What are the steps involved? Right. So that's all, friend, in this video. I hope that you understand what India tried to did and how India should leverage their learnings in the 5G path process. And this was a very complicated video, friends. And I tried my level best to make it simple. I would also like to draw your attention to an article that I wrote, right, on 13 March 2020, which kind of list out all that India did with documents which are mapped to this article. Means whatever I say with conviction, with proof. So you see that there are documents which are mapped to this. I explained what is LMLC, right? Which that it is large. The definition of LMLC has been described here, and then a low mobility large scale, a large cell, which has been defined here. And then I talk about the integration with 3GPP, and then India's own RIT observation with ITU and TSDSI RIT, and then the LMNC in 3.5 gigahertz band, the problem that we face of 3.5 gigahertz band in rural setting. And then I describe the challenge of pivot to BPSK in lower frequency, and the evaluating India's TSDSI's RIT radio interface technology, and I conclude. So this was a very well researched article. So anybody who wants to know further on this and learn from what India did can have access to this article, and paste a link of this article in the description. So I hope that, friends, you understood what I wanted to convey. And thanks for listening till the end. And I'll come back with a new video on a new topic next time. Thank you very much, friends, for listening till the end.